It was Emily's 24th birthday, and she was celebrating alone. She sat in her wheelchair at a small table in an elegant cafe, the scent of roasted coffee and almond croissants hanging in the air. In front of her was a single perfect slice of chocolate cake, a lone candle flickering bravely in its center. Her phone, resting on the table, was a graveyard of good intentions. A string of text messages, all variations of the same theme. "So sorry, Em, something came up at work. Rain check on birthday drinks? I'm swamped. Happy birthday. We'll celebrate soon, I promise." She managed a small, sad but resilient smile. It was okay. She was used to it. She closed her eyes, made a silent wish, and took a small breath to blow out the candle. Across the room, Dr. Anthony Sinclair was grabbing a quick espresso between a grueling 12-hour surgery and a hospital board meeting. He was running on fumes, his mind a whirlwind of patient charts and budget projections. But then, his gaze fell on a scene that cut through his hurried exhaustion. He saw the girl in the wheelchair. He saw the solitary cake, the single, flickering candle. But most of all, he saw the quiet, unshakable dignity in her face as she prepared to celebrate her own birthday in a room full of strangers. Something about her resilience, her refusal to look broken, touched a part of him he had long thought dormant. It broke through his routine, his schedule, his carefully constructed world of clinical detachment. He watched as she took a breath to blow out the candle, and in a move that surprised even himself, an impulse that came from a place of pure, uncalculated humanity, he started walking toward her. Emily opened her eyes, her breath still held, ready to extinguish the small flame. She saw a tall, imposing figure stopping at her table. He was handsome, dressed in expensive surgical scrubs that couldn't hide the aura of power and confidence he wore like a second skin. She expected him to ask her to move, to make way. Instead, he looked at her, then at the candle, and his voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly gentle. "Excuse me," he said, a hint of a warm smile in his eyes. "Can I sit with you?" Emily stared at him, completely shocked. She looked at the empty chair opposite her, a symbol of her loneliness, and then back at his eyes. They held no pity, no condescension, only a quiet, genuine interest. "Of course," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And as the most powerful man in the room sat down to share her lonely birthday, Emily blew out the candle, her silent wish already, impossibly, coming true. An awkward, yet charged silence settled between them as the waiter, without being asked, brought a second fork. Anthony slid the plate with the small cake into the center of the table, a simple sharing gesture that felt monumental. "Happy birthday, Emily," he said softly. "Thank you," she replied, a genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. He didn't ask the question. The question everyone always asked, the one that hung in the air like a heavy curtain whenever she met someone new. What happened? His eyes never flickered down to her wheelchair. He simply looked at her face, as if she were the only person in the room. The absence of the question was the greatest gift he could have given her. It was a silent acknowledgement of her as a person, not a condition. The relief was so profound it loosened the knot of tension in her shoulders. The conversation that followed flowed with a natural, surprising ease. She found herself telling him about her volunteer work at the local library, reading to children, her voice lighting up as she described their funny, unfiltered view of the world. "They don't see the chair," she explained, a small, self-aware smile on her lips. "They just see the person who does the best dragon voices." He chuckled, a low, warm sound that was surprisingly pleasant. "I imagine your dragon voice is formidable." He, in turn, spoke of his own world, but not in the arrogant way of a man boasting of his success. He spoke of the immense pressure of his job, the weight of holding a life in his hands. He used a familiar, relatable anchor to describe the feeling. "It's like the air before a big thunderstorm," he said, looking out the window. "That heavy, electric feeling where you know something is about to break. That's what it feels like right before a complex surgery. You just have to be the calm at the center of it. They discovered a shared, dry sense of humor, a mutual love for old black and white movies, and an intellectual chemistry that sparked with every shared glance. For an hour, she wasn't a girl in a wheelchair, and he wasn't a millionaire surgeon. They were just two people, finding an unexpected refuge in each other's company. All too soon, he glanced at his watch, the cool professional mask settling back over his features. I have to go. I have a surgery scheduled. He signaled for the waiter, reaching for his wallet. Let me get this. Absolutely not, Emily said, her voice firm but her smile warm. She had already placed her own card on the table. Today is my birthday, which means you were a guest at my party, and I always take care of my guests. The quiet strength in her statement, the way she so effortlessly took control of the situation from a position of perceived vulnerability, left him completely fascinated. He stared at her for a moment, a look of genuine, grudging admiration in his eyes. He stood up. Can I see you again? He asked, and the uncharacteristic hesitation in his voice, the voice of a man who commanded operating rooms and boardrooms, was a confession in itself. Emily's heart did a little flip. I'm here every Tuesday, she replied, her own voice a soft, hopeful invitation. It's my day off. He nodded, a slow, thoughtful smile finally breaking across his face. Tuesday, he repeated, as if committing it to memory. He turned and walked away, leaving her alone at the table. And for the first time in years, Emily found herself desperately, eagerly, looking forward to a Tuesday. The following Tuesday, Emily was at the cafe, her heart a nervous, fluttering bird in her chest. She told herself not to be disappointed if he didn't show up. He was a busy, important man. Their birthday encounter was probably just a fleeting moment of kindness, an anomaly in his high-powered life. She opened her book, trying to focus on the words, but her eyes kept flicking toward the door. At precisely 3 o'clock, the exact same time as the week before, the bell above the door chimed. Anthony walked in. He wasn't wearing his surgical scrubs this time, but a simple, well-fitting dark sweater and trousers. He looked relaxed, less like a formidable surgeon and more like just a man. He scanned the room, his eyes found hers, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. He walked to her table, holding 2 steaming mugs. I brought you a latte, he said, placing one in front of her as he sat down, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The barista told me it's your usual. The simple gesture, the fact that he had asked, that he had remembered, sent a warm flush through her. Their first meeting hadn't been a fluke. He had come back. That Tuesday became their ritual. Every week at 3 o'clock, he would appear. The cafe became their sanctuary, a bubble outside of their respective worlds. He never treated her like a patient or a charity case. He treated her like an equal. He would arrive, his shoulders tight with the stress of a long surgery, and as they talked, she would watch the tension slowly melt away. She made him laugh, a real, unforced sound that seemed to surprise him every time. She reminded him that there was a world outside the sterile, high-stakes environment of the hospital. He, in turn, became her window to a world she had lost. He listened, truly listened, when she spoke about her passion for teaching, her frustration with her physical limitations, her dreams. He saw her, not the chair she sat in. With him, she felt not like a paralyzed girl, but simply like Emily. Their friendship deepened, and beneath it, an undeniable current of attraction began to hum, a dangerous, beautiful melody that they both pretended not to hear. One afternoon, about a month into their weekly meetings, they were talking about their pasts. He was telling a funny story about a disastrous first apartment he'd had after his residency. It was right near St. Jude's Hospital, he said casually. I could hear the sirens at all hours. The name made Emily freeze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. St. Jude's. It was the public hospital on the other side of town, the place she had been taken right after her accident. the place where she had spent 6 long, painful months in rehabilitation. St. Jude's, she repeated, her voice a little tight. I did my initial rehab there, after my accident. Anthony went completely still. The warm, relaxed expression on his face vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp tension. A shadow passed over his eyes, a flicker of a pain so deep and so sudden it was like a physical blow. "Oh," he said, his voice suddenly flat, distant. "I see." He recovered quickly, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and changed the subject. But the shift was undeniable. The easy warmth between them was gone, replaced by a new, strange, and unsettling wall. The name of the hospital, a simple random coincidence, had unearthed a ghost, and Emilly had no idea that this ghost was about to change everything. The name St. Jude's echoed in Anthony's mind for the rest of the day. It was a place he hadn't thought about in years, a place he had actively, deliberately, tried to forget. It was the hospital where his ex-fiancée, Sarah, had died. The coincidence was a sharp, unwelcome jolt, bringing back a flood of memories he had spent years trying to suppress. That night, in the sterile silence of his home office, he did something he knew he shouldn't. He told himself it was professional curiosity, a doctor's interest in a unique case. But he knew in the deepest, most honest part of his heart that it was more than that. It was about Emilly. He used his high-level privileges as chief of neurosurgery at the city's top hospital to access the archived records from St. Jude's. He typed in her name, Emilly Carter. Her file appeared on the screen. He scrolled through the initial reports, the details of the car accident that had caused her spinal cord injury. And then he opened the imaging files. He pulled up the MRIs of her spine, his eyes scanning the images with the practiced, analytical gaze of a surgeon. He leaned closer to the screen, his breath catching in his throat. He saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible anomaly at the site of the lesion. A particular pattern of scar tissue formation. It was incredibly rare, a 1 in a million presentation. His heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat in the silent room. He spent the rest of the night pulling up every scan, every doctor's note, every piece of data from her file. He cross-referenced it with his own research, with the data from a new experimental surgical technique he had been developing for the past 3 years. A technique so complex, so high risk, that it had only ever been performed on a handful of patients. As the first light of dawn began to streak the sky, he leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. Her condition, the one that had been diagnosed as a complete permanent transection of the spinal cord, might not be permanent at all. The specific, rare nature of her injury meant that she was one of the few people in the world who might be a candidate for his new procedure. There was a chance. A small, terrifying, and miraculous chance that she could walk again. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was a miracle, and it was a curse. He was plunged into a torturous dilemma. To tell her would be to offer her a hope so immense it was cruel, a hope that could end in failure or worse, in a surgery so risky it could kill her. The memory of Sarah, of her hopeful eyes before her own failed surgery, came rushing back, a ghost of his past failures. He had encouraged her to have hope, and she had died. He couldn't bear the thought of that happening again. Not with Emilly. But not to tell her. Not to tell her would be to condemn her to a life in a wheelchair when there was a possibility, however slim, of a different future. It would be a lie of omission, a betrayal of his oath as a doctor and of the fragile, growing connection he felt for her. He wrestled with the secret for a week. At their next Tuesday meeting at the cafe, he was distant, distracted, the weight of his knowledge a heavy wall between them. Finally, he couldn't bear it anymore. "Emilly," he began, his voice hoarse, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them on the table. I found something. In your old medical records." She looked at him, her brow furrowed with concern at his strange, intense demeanor. "There might be a chance," he said, the words a painful, difficult confession. "A surgery. A new technique I've been working on. It's high risk, extremely high risk. But for your specific type of injury, it might be possible." Her world stopped. The sounds of the cafe, the clinking of cups, the low murmur of conversations, all of it faded into a distant hum. She stared at him, her eyes wide, her lips slightly parted. "A chance," she whispered, the words so quiet he had to lean in to hear them. Her eyes filled with tears, a mixture of a fear so profound it was paralyzing, and a hope so bright it was blinding, a hope she had not allowed herself to feel in 6 long years. Are you telling me there's a chance I could walk again?" Her question, so fragile, so full of a hope he had just resurrected, broke his heart. He knew, in that moment, that he had just placed the weight of her entire world, and his own, on the edge of a surgeon's blade. The revelation left Emily in a state of suspended shock. The world, which had been a predictable, manageable landscape for 6 years, was suddenly a terrifying, exhilarating unknown. The hope Anthony had just given her was a wild, beautiful, and dangerous thing. She didn't give him an answer right away. She couldn't. I need to think," she whispered, her mind a whirlwind. Seeing the fear and confusion in her eyes, Anthony knew he owed her more than just a medical possibility. He owed her the full truth. "Walk with me," he said softly. He took her not to a park or a quiet street, but to a beautiful, serene botanical garden on the outskirts of the city. They moved along the winding paths in silence, the air filled with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. He led her to a secluded bench under a weeping willow beside a quiet, reflective pond. "Before I was a neurosurgeon," he began, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the water, "I was engaged to be married. Her name was Sarah." He told her the story. Sarah had been a vibrant, fearless woman, a rock climber, a traveler. She had been diagnosed with a rare aggressive brain tumor. The prognosis was grim, but there was one option: a radical, high-risk surgery. "The odds were not good," he said, his voice tight with the memory. "But she was a fighter. And I was a young, arrogant resident who believed in miracles. I encouraged her. I told her to have hope. I told her we would fight it together." He paused, the pain of the memory a palpable thing between them. "She died on the operating table," he whispered, the words a raw, unhealed wound. "The surgery was too much for her body. My hope, my encouragement, it led her to a choice that killed her." He finally turned to look at Emily, his eyes filled with a profound, gut-wrenching guilt. "I can't do that again," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I can't be the one to give you hope, Emily, and then watch it destroy you. My fear, it's not about failing the surgery. It's about failing you. It's about losing you." His confession was a quiet, devastating bombshell. His hesitation wasn't about medical arrogance or a lack of faith in his own skills. It was about a deep, profound, and personal trauma. It was about love and loss and a fear so deep it had defined his life for years. Emily listened, her own fear and confusion melting away, replaced by a wave of overwhelming compassion. She saw not a doctor wrestling with a clinical decision, but a man wrestling with his own broken heart. She reached out and placed her hand on his. His hand was cold, trembling slightly. "Anthony," she said, her voice soft but firm, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You didn't kill her. You loved her. You gave her the one thing every person in that situation deserves: a choice, a chance to fight." She squeezed his hand. "And that's what you've given me. Not a false hope. A choice." Her understanding, her complete and total absolution of his deepest guilt, seemed to break through the last of his defenses. He looked at her clear, compassionate eyes, and saw not a patient, but a partner, He leaned in, and in the quiet, dappled light of the weeping willow, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or of desire. It was a kiss of shared pain, of mutual understanding, of two broken souls finding a quiet, unexpected solace in each other. It was a kiss that acknowledged the past, and for the first time hinted at the possibility of a future. The kiss in the botanical garden was a silent pact, a new contract written not in ink, but in a shared, profound understanding. The dynamic between them shifted completely. They were no longer just a doctor and a girl in a cafe. They were Anthony and Emily, two people connected by their scars, both visible and invisible. The possibility of the surgery was now a constant, humming presence in their lives, but Anthony, true to his word, never pressured her. He stepped back from his role as the expert and became her partner in research. He spent hours with her, not explaining medical jargon, but helping her understand it. He printed out clinical studies, highlighted passages, and drew diagrams on napkins in the cafe, empowering her to make her own informed decision. He connected her via video call with other specialists, with patients who had undergone similar high-risk procedures. He was giving her knowledge, not just hope. Emily, in turn, threw herself into the research with the same quiet determination she applied to everything in her life. She was no longer a passive patient. She was an active participant in her own potential future. As the weeks passed, their bond deepened. Their Tuesday meetings at the cafe were now supplemented by late-night phone calls discussing research papers and long, quiet weekends spent in the library. The attraction between them was a powerful, undeniable undercurrent, but they both instinctively knew that their future, whatever it might be, depended on the decision she had to make first. Finally, after a month of intensive research and soul-searching, she knew her answer. She met him at their usual table at the cafe. She looked calm, her eyes clear and resolute. "I've made my decision," she said, her voice steady. He held his breath, his face a mask of nervous anticipation. "I want to fight," she said. "I want to try." A wave of complex emotions washed over his face, relief, fear, admiration. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I'm sure," she confirmed. "I've spent 6 years accepting my reality. You've given me a chance to change it, and I have to take that chance." She looked at him, her expression softening. "I understand your fear, Anthony. I see it, and I will not force you to do anything that would break you." She took a deep breath, her next words a profound act of trust and an incredible inversion of power. "So I need to ask you," she said, her gaze holding his. "If I do this, if I choose to fight, will you be there? Not as my surgeon, not as the brilliant Dr. Sinclair, but as you, as my partner, as the man who sits with me in a cafe on Tuesdays." Her question was not a demand for his skill. It was a plea for his heart. She was giving him an out, respecting his trauma, placing her emotional well-being, and his, above the outcome of the surgery itself. He stared at her, completely disarmed by her strength, by her empathy, by her love. "I would never leave your side, Emily," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. "But," he added, the practical, terrifying question finally being voiced, "who is going to do the surgery?" The question of who would perform the surgery hung between them, a heavy, unspoken truth. Emily knew with every fiber of her being that she wanted it to be him. But she also knew she could never ask. It would be too cruel, a burden too great for him to bear. "I need to explore every option," she told him a few days later, her voice calm and logical. "For both of us." She had researched the top neurosurgeons in the world who specialized in this type of high-risk procedure. At the top of the list was a Dr. Alistair Finch in Zurich, a pioneer in the field and, as it turned out, an old colleague of Anthony's. Anthony, though still terrified, became her fierce, unwavering advocate. He didn't try to dissuade her. He didn't let his own trauma interfere. He simply and completely supported her. He arranged the international video conference with Dr. Finch, and when the time came, he sat by her side, not as a conflicted man, but as her partner and her medical advocate. The video call was intense. Dr. Finch was a brilliant, no-nonsense Swiss doctor who spoke with a blunt honesty. He reviewed Emilly's scans, which Anthony had sent ahead. "The injury is severe," Dr. Finch said, his face serious on the screen. "The procedure is viable, yes. The risks, as you know, are significant." He then turned his attention to Anthony. "But, Anthony," he said, his tone shifting from that of a doctor to that of an old colleague, "you have seen the scans. You know the anomaly in the scar tissue formation. Your own published technique, the Sinclair method, has a statistically significant 5% higher success rate in cases with this specific presentation." The air in the room grew still. "I would be happy to perform the surgery," Dr. Finch continued, his gaze steady. "And I am confident in my abilities. But if this were my daughter, my wife, if this were my family sitting in front of me," he paused, his eyes locking onto Anthony's through the screen, "I would ask you to do it." The declaration was a thunderclap. It was not an opinion. It was a professional, ethical, and deeply personal endorsement from one of the best surgeons in the world. It placed the decision, the responsibility, and the hope squarely back on Anthony's shoulders. After the call ended, a profound silence filled the room. Anthony stood up and walked to the window, his back to her, his shoulders tense. Emily watched him, her heart aching for the impossible choice he now faced. She rolled her wheelchair over to him. She didn't touch him. She just waited. "I'm not afraid, Anthony," she said softly, her voice a steady, quiet anchor in his storm of doubt. "Not if it's you." She paused, giving him the one thing he had never had with Sarah, a choice, free from pressure or expectation. "But I would never ask you to do something that would destroy you," she continued, her voice full of a love and an understanding that was absolute. "The final choice is yours, and whatever you decide, I will respect it, and I will not love you any less." She had given him the power, but she had also, in the most profound way possible, given him her unconditional forgiveness before he had even made a choice. Emily's words, her quiet, unconditional trust, were the one thing Anthony's carefully constructed defenses were not prepared for. He had spent years building walls to protect himself from the pressure of hope, from the agony of failure. But she wasn't pressuring him. She was freeing him. The weight of the decision was immense, but for the first time it was not a burden of guilt. It was a burden of love. He spent the next 24 hours in his office at the hospital, not agonizing, but preparing. He locked himself away with her scans, with his research, with every piece of data he had. He ran simulations on a computer model. He consulted with his team. He mapped out every possible contingency, every potential complication. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a new, fierce, and unwavering determination. That evening, Emily knew he would be at the hospital. She also knew he wouldn't have eaten. She packed a simple dinner of his favorite pasta and a thermos of hot coffee, and took a taxi to the hospital. She found him in his darkened office, the only light coming from the glowing three-dimensional models of her spine on his massive computer screens. He was completely absorbed, his focus absolute. He looked up as she entered, a flicker of surprise in his tired eyes. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Neither should you," she countered gently, placing the container of food on his desk. "You need to eat." She didn't press him about his decision. She didn't ask about the surgery. She just sat with him in the quiet of his office, a silent, supportive presence. She knew that this was a battle he had to fight on his own. As he ate, she looked at him, at the brilliant, dedicated, and deeply wounded man she had fallen in love with. "I just came to say one thing," she said softly, as she prepared to leave. He looked up at her, his eyes full of a weary gratitude. "Whatever you decide for tomorrow," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I am already grateful. You gave me back the one thing I thought I had lost forever. You gave me back hope. And no matter what happens, no one can ever take that away from me again." She turned and left him alone in his office. Her words were the final key. She wasn't just his patient. She wasn't just the woman he loved. She was his partner, and she was fighting right alongside him. He looked at the complex, beautiful, and terrifying images of her spine on his screen. He thought of Sarah, of his failure, of his fear. And then he thought of Emily, of her strength, of her trust, of her unwavering love. He picked up his phone and made a call to the hospital's chief administrator. "I need to book the main neurosurgical OR for tomorrow morning," he said, his voice no longer hesitant or afraid. It was the firm, steady, and resolute voice of a surgeon. "For a spinal reconstruction, and I will be leading the team." He looked at her scans one last time, a slow, determined smile spreading across his face. "It's not hope I want to give you, Emily," he whispered to the empty room. "It's a future." He was going to do the surgery. Because his greatest fear was no longer failing as a doctor. His greatest fear was failing the woman he loved by not having the courage to fight for her. The morning of the surgery was filled with a strange, surreal calm. Emily was not afraid. She lay in the pre-op room, the sterile scent of antiseptic in the air, and felt a profound sense of peace. Her faith in Anthony was absolute. He appeared at her bedside just before they were scheduled to take her to the operating room. He was dressed in his surgical scrubs, his face hidden behind a mask, but his eyes, the same intense blue eyes that had first met hers across a lonely cafe, were full of a calm, focused determination. He didn't say anything. He just took her hand. "I trust you, Anthony," she whispered, her voice clear and steady. "I know," he replied, his voice muffled by the mask. He squeezed her hand one last time. "I'll see you on the other side." The confidence in her eyes was the last thing he saw before the doors to the operating room swung shut. It was the armor he would carry with him into battle. The surgery was a marathon, a complex 12-hour procedure that required a level of precision and artistry that few surgeons in the world possessed. Anthony was in his element, a master at work. His team moved around him with a practiced, silent efficiency, every instrument, every suture, a seamless extension of his will. Hours ticked by. He successfully navigated the treacherous landscape of her spine, meticulously removing the scar tissue, preparing the site for the delicate reconstruction. Everything was going perfectly. He was in complete control. And then it happened. A sudden, sharp beep from the cardiac monitor. A frantic shout from the anesthesiologist. "Her blood pressure is dropping, rapidly." A rare, 1 in a million complication. A vascular anomaly near the surgical site had ruptured. It was the exact same complication, in the exact same location, that had taken Sarah's life on his operating table all those years ago. The room went cold. The surgical team froze, a collective, horrified gasp rippling through the OR. Anthony looked up from the surgical field, his eyes locking onto the plummeting numbers on the monitor. The sterile, controlled operating room dissolved around him, replaced by the ghost of his past failure. He could hear Sarah's laughter. He could see her hopeful eyes. He could feel the crushing, absolute powerlessness of watching her slip away. For a single terrifying second, he was paralyzed. The trauma, the guilt, the fear, it all came rushing back, a tidal wave threatening to drown him. His hands, the steady, brilliant hands of a master surgeon, began to tremble. The monitor let out a long, continuous, high-pitched tone. Cardiac arrest. She was gone. "We're losing her, doctor," a nurse cried out. The sound of the nurse's voice, the sound of Emily's name unspoken in the air, snapped him back to the present. He looked at the open surgical field, at the life of the woman he loved slipping through his fingers. And in that moment, A new, fierce, and unwavering resolve burned through his fear. He would not let the past win. He would not fail her. "Paddles," he roared, his voice a commanding thunderclap that shook the room out of its paralysis. "Charge to 200." He was no longer the haunted man. He was the surgeon. He was the protector. He was the man who had promised her a future, and he would be damned if he didn't keep that promise. The chaos of the operating room gave way to the hushed, rhythmic beeping of the ICU. The surgery, after that single, terrifying moment of crisis, had been a technical masterpiece. Fueled by a desperate, adrenaline-laced focus, Anthony had performed the emergency vascular repair with a brilliance that left his entire team in awe. He had then completed the delicate spinal reconstruction, his hands steady, his mind clear. Technically, the surgery was a success. But as Emily lay in the quiet, sterile room, surrounded by a web of wires and monitors, the real outcome remained a terrifying unknown. Anthony did not leave her side. He refused to go home, refused to rest. He sat in a chair by her bed, still in his scrubs, his world shrinking to the steady rise and fall of her chest, the rhythmic pulse on the monitor. The hours ticked by, each one an eternity of waiting, of hoping, of praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. He was no longer a doctor. He was just a man, terrified of losing the woman he loved. She woke up on the second day. Her eyelids fluttered open, her gaze hazy, unfocused. The first thing she saw was him. He was right there, his face etched with exhaustion and a profound, desperate relief. "Anthony?" she whispered, her voice a dry, scratchy rasp. He was on his feet in an instant, his hand finding hers, his touch gentle, reverent. "I'm here, Emily," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. "I'm right here." She smiled, a weak, fragile thing, but it was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. "We did it," she whispered. He squeezed her hand. "We did it," he confirmed. A comfortable silence settled between them. The nurses came and went, checking her vitals, adjusting her IV. But Anthony remained, a silent, constant guardian. Later that afternoon, after she had rested, the moment of truth arrived. The lead neurologist came in to perform the first post-operative assessment. Anthony stood at the foot of the bed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. "All right, Emily," the neurologist said gently. "I want you to try something for me. Don't strain. Just try to wiggle the toes on your right foot." The room fell silent. Emily closed her eyes, her face a mask of intense concentration. She focused all of her will, all of her hope, on that single, simple command. She could feel the connection in her mind, the ghost of a signal being sent down a path that had been dark for 6 long years. She tried, and nothing happened. The sheet at the end of the bed remained perfectly, heartbreakingly still. "Okay," the neurologist said, his voice carefully neutral. "Let's try the left." Again she tried, her brow furrowed with effort. Again, nothing. A wave of cold, sickening disappointment washed over her. She looked at Anthony, and the look on his face, a look of such profound, gut-wrenching failure, broke her heart more than her own immobility ever could. He looked utterly, completely destroyed. He believed he had failed her. Her smile, when it came, was a little wobbly, a little strained, but it was there. "Hey," she whispered, her voice surprisingly strong. He couldn't meet her eyes. He just stared at her still, unmoving feet. "Anthony, look at me," she commanded softly. He slowly, reluctantly, lifted his gaze to hers. The brilliant, confident surgeon was gone, replaced by a man drowning in his own guilt. "It's okay," she said, her voice a soft, steady anchor. The doctor, the physical therapist, they all said this could happen. They said the connection is there, but the path is asleep. It needs to be woken up. It takes time. I should have warned you, he choked out, his voice raw with self-blame. I shouldn't have let you hope for a miracle. You didn't, she countered gently, her eyes shining with an unwavering faith that stunned him. You gave me a chance, and the fight isn't over. It's just beginning. She squeezed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. But I can't do it alone. He looked at her, at this incredible, resilient woman who, in her moment of what should have been devastating disappointment, was comforting him. She was not broken. She was a warrior. Don't you dare feel guilty, she whispered fiercely. And don't you dare give up on me now. I need my partner. In the quiet of that sterile hospital room, in the face of what felt like a catastrophic failure, she was his strength. She was his hope. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he would not, could not, ever leave her side. The days that followed were a slow, agonizing crawl. The initial post-surgical optimism in the hospital gave way to a quiet, clinical reality. Emily's legs remained unresponsive. The technical success of the surgery felt like a hollow victory in the face of her continued paralysis, and Anthony was consumed by it. He retreated back into himself, the guilt a poison that seeped into every corner of his life. He was a ghost in her hospital room, performing his duties as a doctor with a cold, detached efficiency. But the man who had held her hand, the man who had kissed her in the garden, was gone. He avoided her gaze, his conversations brief and focused only on her medical status. He was punishing himself, convinced that he had failed her, that he had repeated the same mistake he had made with Sarah. Emily, however, refused to let his guilt become her reality. She saw his retreat for what it was, not a rejection of her, but a manifestation of his own deep, unhealed trauma, and she knew she had to be the one to pull him out of it. She attacked her physical therapy with a fierce, relentless determination. The sessions were brutal, painful, and often ended in frustrating tears, but she never gave up. She worked with her therapist, a kind but firm woman named Maria, for hours every day, pushing her body to its absolute limit, trying to reforge the connection between her mind and her limbs. The surgery was a miracle, Emily, Maria told her one afternoon as she helped her stretch her unresponsive leg muscles. Dr. Sinclair re-established the neural pathway. It's there. It's like a road that has been closed for 6 years. The cars, the signals from your brain, have forgotten how to get there. Our job is to clear the debris and teach them the way home. It's a battle of patience and of will. Armed with that knowledge, Emily knew she had to confront Anthony. She asked a nurse to page him. He entered her room a few minutes later, his face a mask of professional concern, his eyes fixed on her chart, not on her. How are you feeling, Emily? Any changes in sensation? I'm feeling frustrated, she said, her voice calm and direct. He finally looked at her. I'm frustrated that the man I love is so consumed by his own guilt that he can't even see that I'm not giving up, she said, her gaze unwavering. He flinched, the words a direct hit. Emily, Stop, she interrupted softly. Stop apologizing. Stop hiding. Look at me, Anthony. He reluctantly met her eyes, and she saw the raw pain and self-loathing there. You did not fail, she said, her voice ringing with a strength that filled the room. You gave me a chance. You opened a door that has been closed for 6 years. Now the fight is mine. This is my battle to win, but I cannot do it without my partner. She held out her hand to him. Are you going to give up on me now? Her question was not an accusation. It was an invitation, a plea. She was not blaming him. She was asking for his help. She was reminding him that they were a team. He stared at her outstretched hand, then at her face, at the fierce, unwavering belief in her eyes. Her strength, her refusal to be broken, was the one thing that could shatter his guilt. Slowly, hesitantly, he walked to her bedside and took her hand. His grip was tight, desperate. Never, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I will never give up on you. Anthony's return was a turning point. He was no longer just her doctor. He was her partner, her coach, her unwavering source of support. He transformed her hospital room into a command center for her recovery. He brought in the best physical therapists, the most advanced rehabilitation equipment, and he was there for every single brutal, painful session. The work was grueling. It was a slow, frustrating, and often heartbreaking process. There were days when Emily would dissolve into tears of pure frustration, her body refusing to obey the commands of her mind. There were days when the pain was so intense she could barely breathe. But through it all, Anthony was there. He was not the detached surgeon. He was the man who would kneel on the floor beside her therapy mat, his voice a low, steady murmur of encouragement. You can do this, Emily. Just one more. Breathe. He would hold her hand, his grip a lifeline, as she struggled through a particularly painful stretch. He would be there with a cool cloth for her forehead, a glass of water, a quiet, understanding presence that said more than words ever could. He learned her body's language of pain and exhaustion better than any chart could tell him. He knew when to push her and when to let her rest. He celebrated every tiny, microscopic victory, a flicker of a muscle in her thigh, a faint tingling sensation in her calf, as if it were a major medical breakthrough. Their life became a rhythm of shared struggle and shared hope. They were a team, united against a single, stubborn enemy, her own body. The moment that changed everything came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, 3 months after the surgery. They were in the physical therapy room, late in the day, the space empty except for them and her therapist, Maria. Emily was strapped into a harness, suspended over a set of parallel bars, her legs weak and unresponsive beneath her. She was exhausted, her muscles screaming, her spirit flagging. I can't, she whispered, her head hanging in defeat. I can't do it, Anthony. It's not working. He walked over to her, kneeling in front of her so that his eyes were level with hers. He took her face in his hands, his touch gentle but firm. Yes, you can, he said, his voice a low, fierce whisper. Look at me, Emily. Look at me. She lifted her tear-filled eyes to his. You are the strongest person I have ever known, he said, his gaze intense, unwavering. You have fought every single day. You have not given up. Do not give up now. Not on yourself, and not on us. He didn't let go of her face. We do this together, he said. Right now. Focus on me, just me. She looked into his eyes, into the deep, endless blue, and found a strength she didn't know she had. She took a deep, shuddering breath. She focused all of her will, all of her energy, all of her love for the man kneeling before her into a single thought. Move. With his hand still framing her face, his eyes locked on hers, she pushed. She pushed with everything she had. And with a small, shaky, almost imperceptible movement, she took a single, hesitant step. The world seemed to stop. Maria gasped. Anthony's eyes widened, filling with tears. She had done it. We did it, she whispered, a triumphant, breathless laugh escaping her lips. Yes, he breathed, his own voice choked with emotion. We did. That single, hesitant step was the key that unlocked everything. It was the proof. The connection, which had been a faint, whispered signal for so long, was now a clear, undeniable path. The road home, as Maria had called it, was finally open. The progress after that day was slow, but it was steady. The single step became 2, then 3. The shaky, uncertain movements became more confident, more controlled. Each day was a new victory, a new milestone in their shared journey. Anthony was there for every moment. He was there when she took her first unassisted steps between the parallel bars, his face a mask of such profound pride and joy, it made her heart ache. He was there when she graduated from the parallel bars to a walker, and then from the walker to a single, elegant cane. Their relationship deepened with every step she took. The hospital room was no longer a place of sickness and recovery. It was the backdrop to their love story. They would have quiet dinners in her room, the bland hospital food tasting like a gourmet meal because they were sharing it. They would watch old black and white movies on his laptop, propped up on her bedside table, their hands always intertwined, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. The sterile, beeping world of the hospital faded away, leaving only the two of them in their own private, quiet universe. One evening, about a month after her first step, she was walking slowly, carefully, down the empty hospital corridor, leaning on her cane, with Anthony walking beside her. The rhythmic tap of her cane on the polished linoleum floor was a sound of victory. "I'm tired of this place," she said, a playful pout on her lips. "I'm tired of hospital gowns and the smell of antiseptic. I want to go on a real date." He smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "And where would the lovely Miss Carter like to go?" She stopped and turned to him, her eyes sparkling with a challenge. "I want to go dancing," she said. The request was audacious, beautiful, and so perfectly her. He looked at her, at this incredible woman who had fought her way back from the brink, and his heart swelled with a love so powerful it almost hurt. A week later, he made it happen. He didn't take her to a crowded club or a grand ballroom. He knew she wasn't ready for that. Instead, he reserved the small, private rooftop garden of the hospital, a place usually reserved for quiet contemplation. He had it transformed. Hundreds of tiny, warm fairy lights were woven through the trellises and potted trees, creating a canopy of soft, glittering stars. In the corner, a lone cellist played a soft, beautiful melody, a piece by Bach he knew she loved. He had helped her dress, not as a doctor, but as a man helping the woman he loved. He had chosen a simple, flowing gown of deep sapphire blue that matched his eyes. As she walked toward him across the terrace, her step still careful but steady, her cane left forgotten by the door, he felt his breath catch in his throat. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He held out his hand. "May I have this dance?" She placed her hand in his, a brilliant, happy smile on her face. "You may, Doctor." He pulled her into his arms, his one hand on her waist, the other holding hers, supporting her, guiding her. And they danced. It was not a grand, sweeping waltz. It was a slow, simple shuffle, their bodies moving together under the canopy of lights. He was her anchor, her support, his strength her own. She leaned her head against his chest, closing her eyes, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart beneath her ear. The familiar clean scent of his starched shirt and the subtle woody notes of his aftershave filled her senses. It was the scent of safety, the scent of home. "I love you, Anthony," she whispered, her voice muffled by his shirt. The words a quiet, certain truth she no longer had to hide. He held her tighter, his lips brushing against her hair. "I love you, Emilly," he replied, his own voice thick with an emotion so profound it was almost painful. "More than you will ever know." They swayed to the music, two souls who had found each other in a lonely cafe, who had battled trauma and fear together, and who were now, finally, dancing under the stars. For them, in that moment, it was the most perfect, most beautiful dance in the world. 6 months later, the world was vibrant again, painted in colors Emilly had forgotten existed. The rhythmic tap of a cane on pavement was a distant memory, replaced by the confident, easy stride of a woman who had reclaimed her life. She walked into her first-grade classroom each morning, the scent of chalk dust, crayons, and that unique sweet smell of young children, a joyful anchor to her new reality. The sound of their laughter as they ran around the schoolyard during recess was a daily, beautiful symphony, a constant reminder of the future she had fought so hard for. Her life was no longer defined by the 4 wheels of her chair, but by the infinite possibilities of her own 2 feet. Anthony, too, had been reborn. The cynical, guarded surgeon who had built a fortress around his heart was gone. In his place was a man filled with a quiet, profound purpose. His colleagues at the hospital noticed the change. The brilliant but cold Dr. Sinclair now lingered by his patients' bedsides, his hand on a worried family member's shoulder, his explanations no longer just a clinical recitation of facts, but a compassionate conversation. He had learned that healing was more than just a successful surgery. He had poured his energy and a significant portion of his fortune into establishing the Sarah Sinclair Foundation for Neurological Innovation. It wasn't just a tax write-off or a vanity project. It was his penance and his promise. He personally oversaw the selection of research grants, championing the most audacious, high-risk, and potentially groundbreaking ideas, the very kind of long-shot science that had given Emily her life back. He was no longer just fixing bodies. He was actively building hope. Their love story, once a secret whispered in the sterile confines of a hospital room, had settled into a beautiful, comfortable rhythm. They were a team, their lives seamlessly intertwined. They spent their weekends exploring the city, their evenings cooking together, their nights filled with quiet conversation and easy intimacy. The vast, minimalist penthouse, once a symbol of his isolation, had been transformed. It was now their home. Emily's colorful paintings, vibrant and full of life, now hung on the stark white walls, a joyful rebellion against the cool, controlled aesthetic. Her favorite worn-out armchair, brought over from her old apartment, sat in a sun-drenched corner of the living room, a comfortable, unpretentious island in a sea of designer furniture. The air, once sterile, now often carried the warm, comforting scent of the bread she had started baking, a hobby she had picked up during her recovery. One crisp autumn afternoon, a day so perfect it felt like a memory from a dream, he came home early from the hospital. He found her in the living room, curled up in her armchair, fast asleep, a book open in her lap. He stood there for a long moment, just watching her, a wave of love so powerful it almost buckled his knees. This was his life now, this quiet, beautiful peace. He gently woke her. "I have a surprise for you," he said, a mischievous, familiar glint in his blue eyes. "A surprise?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "Close your eyes," he murmured. He led her by the hand, her trust in him absolute. She felt the familiar rumble of the elevator, the cool city air on her skin as they stepped outside, the soft, luxurious leather of his car. She could smell the familiar scent of roasted coffee and almond croissants before they even stopped. She could hear the low murmur of conversations and the clinking of ceramic cups. "Okay," he said softly. "Open them." She opened her eyes. They were in the cafe, their cafe, and their table, the one by the window, was waiting for them. It was reserved, a single, perfect white rose in a small vase at its center. The same barista who had served them for months greeted them with a wide, knowing smile. They sat down, the scene a perfect echo of their first meeting, but the universe had shifted. She was not the lonely girl with a single candle, and he was not the detached stranger. They were two whole people, their journey reflected in the easy, loving smiles they shared across the table. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Emily said, her voice full of a quiet wonder as she looked around the bustling cafe. "It was," he agreed, his hand covering hers on the table. "We were different people then." He looked at her, his eyes serious, intense, and filled with a love so deep it was endless. The playful, charming man was gone, replaced by a man about to make the most important declaration of his life. "I didn't bring you a birthday cake today," he said, his voice a low, steady murmur that cut through the noise of the cafe, creating a bubble of intimacy just for them. "Because I don't want to just celebrate one of your birthdays." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I want to give you all of them, for the rest of our lives." He slid from his chair and got down on one knee. A collective gasp went through the cafe, followed by a sudden, hushed silence as all eyes turned to them. He didn't seem to notice. He only had eyes for her. Anthony knelt on the floor of the bustling cafe, holding a small velvet box in his hand. He opened it. Inside was not a large, flashy diamond, but a simple, elegant ring with a single, perfect sapphire, the exact color of his eyes. "Emily Carter," he began, his voice clear and steady, though his hand was trembling slightly. "You came into my life like a quiet miracle. You taught me how to hope again. You taught me how to fight again. And you taught me how to love again. You saved me from the ghost of my past, and you showed me what a future could look like." He looked up at her, his heart in his eyes. "I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you deserve. I want to be your partner, your protector, your home. Will you marry me, Emily?" Tears of pure, unadulterated joy streamed down her face. The entire cafe was silent, watching, holding its breath. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with happiness. "Yes." "Of course, yes!" The cafe erupted in spontaneous, joyful applause. Anthony slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. He stood up, pulling her into a deep, loving kiss that sealed their promise in front of the world. 1 year later, they stood on a sun-drenched cliff overlooking the ocean. Their wedding was a small, intimate affair, attended only by their closest friends and family. Emily walked down the grassy aisle, her steps strong and sure, her hand held tightly in her father's. As she reached the altar, Anthony took her hands, his eyes shining with a love that was as vast and as deep as the ocean behind them. Their vows were simple, heartfelt promises. He promised to never again let his fear be greater than his love for her. He promised to be her strength, her partner, and her biggest champion, always. She promised to always remind him of the power of hope, to be his calm in any storm, and to never stop fighting for their future, together. As they were pronounced husband and wife, they kissed, not as a doctor and a patient, not as a savior and the saved, but as two whole, healed people who had found in each other the one thing they had both thought was lost forever: a home for their hearts. They had saved each other, and now they were ready to walk, side by side, into the rest of their lives.